All right. So it's 2 minutes. There's no one else in the waiting room. I guess people are going to start signing up as we go. So um, let me remind you that this session is being recorded so that we can have this for the future. And who knows, maybe our children or children's children will come back and visit this recording and remember, oh, yes, remember when COP28 happened and all those accomplishments that we didn't see it coming. Well, here is a recording for our testimonial. And everyone, welcome again to this session. Before we start, we would like to acknowledge that Royal Roads campus stands on the lands of the Lekwungen speaking people, which are the Esquimalt and Tonquis nations. And with gratitude, we have come here together, learning, playing, working in this beautiful land under a beautiful sky, which is very cloudy today, in a beautiful forest. And well, it's a great opportunity and a privilege to be here. So we better acknowledge that we are in this beautiful place. If you come to us from a different place, from the lands of other Indigenous nations, it would be incredible if you could share that with us so that we can express our gratitude together to them. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Gabriela Vieyra, or Gabi. I'm originally from Mexico. Currently, I'm the ops manager of the Cascade Institute, located here in Royal Roads campus at the Rose Garden Cottage, where I am connecting from. And today we have a beautiful panel of esteemed colleagues and friends who basically are here together to share their insights about COP28. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So in no particular order, let's go with Julie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's going to be a challenging one, I think, but before we get into that, I appreciate the time for acknowledgements. So my name is Julie MacArthur. I am an associate professor at Royal Roads University in the Faculty of Management and a Canada Research Chair who focuses on energy democracy and energy transitions. And I am coming in as well from the really close to Royal Roads campus, actually, on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. Gabby, did you want us to do our couple of minutes of reflection?
No, not yet.
Or just the introduction?
Let's start with introductions, and then we'll get started with your pitch.
All right. Well, on to the next person then.
Thank you. Leslie, please.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you all here. I was really worried that no one would come in case anyone else was as depressed about COP28 as I was. However, it's good to see you all here. My name is Leslie King. I'm Professor of Environment and Sustainability at Royal Roads here. And I've been to many, many COPs in my lifetime, but most recently was just Paris. I liked going out on a high note at COP21. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Leslie. Robin, can we hear from you, please?
Hi, thanks, Gabby. Hello, everyone. Thanks for showing up to this discussion. As Julie said, probably going to be an interesting one. Yeah, I'm a settler. I live in what I know as James Bay on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Lekwungen speaking families and their ancestors. And before I say what other things I am, I just want to acknowledge what a privilege it is to live where I live and be able to, I don't know, enjoy and take responsibility myself for the amazing waters and lands that have been cared for so many generations by Indigenous peoples. I'm also a professor at Royal Roads in 2 programs, the Disaster and Emergency Management Program and the more recent MA in Climate Action Leadership Program. And I also run a research and capacity building lab that focuses on building climate action leadership capacity with youth and with professionals and within our educational system. So really, really pleased to be here.
Thank you, Robin. Last but not least, Tad.
Hello there. Thank you, Gabby. Tad Homer-Dixon, Executive Director of the Cascade Institute. I am literally across the hall from Gabby. in a relatively adjacent office. So, and that's it. That's pretty well all I have to say about myself. So let's get on with the conversation.
Thank you, Tad. Let's remember what COP28 is all about, the 28th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a pivotal international gathering where representatives from nations around the world convene to address the pressing challenges of climate change. This conference provides a platform for global leaders, policymakers, scientists, and advocates to discuss, negotiate, and make decisions on climate action and environmental issues, allegedly. So as Ryan wrote, Climate Week and COP28 come to an end. We're here today to critically examine the progress and the failures of this annual global climate conference. So to get us started, as Julie mentioned, let's give a round of 3-4 minutes for everyone to share with us what their insights have been about COP28. And let's start, if you're okay with that, in the same order that we started. So Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Gabby. Yeah, so just a few points, I think, to get started. My main takeaway from watching what was going on in this COP has to do with the centrality of oil and gas interests in it. I'd started really with the location of the COP and also the fact that it was being led by a person who's also the head of a state oil company. During this COP, we had the OPEC letters come out urging countries with strong fossil fuel interests and countries that were part of OPEC to reject and push back against any mention really of fossil fuel, and then push on a lot of the wordsmithing. So that's really one of the big things from this COP, was just how visible that pushback of fossil fuel and oil and gas industry actors are in the global climate processes. And there was a lot written on it, but also for me, in some ways, though, as frustrating as that is, because it certainly slows, delays, retards, and gets in the way of our ability to make the radical changes necessary, those actors are very much central in the governance system anyway. So having that be so visible, I think, is also potentially quite useful. So this COP was helpful along those lines of making visible the centrality of those actors. But also in another way, I think the fact that the final text, which comes out with language around transitioning from fossil fuels and energy systems, so naming them, first of all, which is a shift from previous iterations, and then a lot of focus in language on just transitions. On in that same sentence, they talk about a just, orderly, and equitable manner for transitions in this critical decade. I think there are some issues around language that are really problematic and part of discourses of delay, but at the same time, other ones that are actually excellent to start to have in there and part of kind of a ratcheting towards where we might want to go. I think the number of countries that were behind a fossil fuel phase out at that early stage, these significant oil producing ones, et cetera, notwithstanding, I think that was also heartening too. So my big kind of things though were about that really visible centrality of oil and gas interests, the leadership essentially in a petro state, and with all of the challenges that brought, but then also visibly seeing how the language around loss and damage, around just transitions, still ended up there, and the really powerful moving mobilization by especially the small island states who could not ultimately sign on because of the very crucial, existential issues that they're facing. So that's probably enough from me to get us started. So very mixed feelings, but I think I just oriented this way. I have to be, there's hope in everything. I think we have to keep looking for that without being Pollyannas about it. And I think people who weren't expecting large fossil fuel interests to be doing what they do, I think that's problematic in and of itself. So politics and power is always going to be in these things. Okay.
Thank you, Julie. Can you hear me better now? Did the headset improve the thing? Excellent. We're on the right track then. Thank you, Julie. Let's go over to Leslie then. Your mic Leslie. Still playing games up here. There you go.
Abby. I thought that the Guardian stole my joke about good cop, bad cop. But of course it wasn't very original. However, that's the way I've been thinking about this COP. It started off with operationalizing the loss and damage agreement, and various countries made pledges. Canada couldn't make a pledge larger than the US, so we pledged 16 million of the 100 billion that is required for this fund, and the actual closer to 400 billion in costs of the disasters that have spread across the globe as a result of climate change. So that was the first good and bad. Then some good things happened along the lines of integrating issues, because everything's connected to climate change. So we came out with language about food and the countries incorporating food and agriculture into their NDCs. Day 10 was a nature and climate day. There was a health day. And so that was progress in terms of recognizing all of the connections brought about by climate change. So I won't talk too much. The methane pledge was a plus, but of course the largest emitter of methane did not sign on to the pledge, and that's China. So we had good cop, bad cop existing together throughout the whole week, and it was a roller coaster ride. Then, Julie, you're absolutely right. Fossil fuels have not been on the agenda, and so that was definitely a plus. And the OPEC letter had about it, as someone said, the whiff of desperation, which I think was a good sign. The final wording broke my heart, and I think it broke the heart of the small island states who cried at the end of the COP. But of course, it is on the agenda. So I think I'm going to, I'm the world's most optimistic person. Otherwise, I could not have taught environmental studies for my whole life. So I'm going to rest on some good things. One glimmer of hope, and it's only a glimmer at the moment. People are coming around to the idea that we need to reform the global financial architecture. The last time it was reformed was after the Second World War, creating the World Bank and the IMF, etc. But they're totally, hopelessly outdated to address the climate crisis. And people are starting to recognize that, and starting to recognize that at least half of the world can't afford to address climate change, but they can't get loans because, of course, they're in debt crisis all over the world. 70 countries are in debt crisis. So I think that's just a little glimmer, and I'm hoping that we'll add to that in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Let's go over to you, Robin.
Thanks. Of course, as we go through, we'll probably be reiterating the same key points. I won't be the exception. One of the things for me with this COP, I've approached is I have not been to one as Leslie has. I could have gone to one, but decided not to go to one for travel reasons. Anyway, I have like a huge dose of skepticism around these kinds of processes. They are inherently conservative. They have to be conservative because they're consensus documents, and getting 198 countries to agree on something, it's, in some ways is a win in of itself. So that sense, bilateralism at work, doing what it does. And so, but part of the shift for me, and it's listening to other people's critiques of it, other people's thoughts on it, people who are deeply embedded in the process, who have worked in the process. And I get that sense of, I don't know if it's optimism from them, but reframing these events, these kinds of large international government agreements as a signal, as a, these agreements are not going to accomplish what we need them to accomplish. They are not going to get action going in a direct sense, but they signal an intention, and that intention can inform others, businesses, organizations, cities, other governments, certainly, of a direction, of a global agreement around a direction. And so that is a good thing. And as others have said, the inclusion of fossil fuels, even the two words, fossil fuels, in a COP agreement, it's the first time that's ever happened. It's like my brain kind of explodes when I acknowledge that inside. It's like the first time a COP has talked about fossil fuels and had it in the agreement. So that's worth noting. And with all of the limitations, the vague language around transitioning, the loopholes that exist, it's riddled, it's Swiss cheese kind of agreement on fossil fuels, but at least it's there. And it signals that, from that kind of like from a business orientation anyway, and monetary funds, investment funds, it signals loud and clear, don't be investing in fossil fuels, because if there's another direction here. So that is a good thing, even though it's like very, very flawed and limited. Other things that have already been mentioned, I think, other wins around the inclusion, as you were saying, Leslie, that this COP really brought in other issues and integrated them in, health and food, et cetera. And that's really important. Again, they didn't go far enough. I know a lot of countries, particularly in developing countries, are really disappointed with the language around food and food systems, because it's such a huge part of contributing to global emissions. It's such a huge part of contributing to biodiversity loss. And we're just now starting to think, oh, climate change and food, they're connected. So it's a small win to have some thinking about it. We need to go much further, obviously. And then, the other things around, great that we're ramping, or the languages around ramping up renewables and, energy efficiency, and doing it within this decade. So that's really good, because we have a very narrow window here, a shrinking window, to even come close to 1.5 degrees. And as we know from the global stock taking report, we're way off track of that. So, I guess that's a good thing. And then I think the other thing is to really look at the investment in the loss and damage fund as a good thing. So yes, this is your good cop, bad cop. It's great that countries, including Canada, have pledged money. So there's about $500 million there. It's a fraction of what's needed annually already in 2023 for what we spend on loss and damage around climate change. And that only escalates every year we go through, some of it locked in escalation. So it's a good first step. It's completely inadequate. And we need to, obviously, with this and all the other pledges, the other key message is, proof is going to be in the pudding of implementation, and thus far we have not been doing well on that. If we believe if we look at the global stock taking, so that's mine.
Thank you very much, Robin. Let's go over to you, Ted.
Hi there. We had an interesting exchange just as we were waiting in the green room beforehand. I think that there is a significant amount of despair surrounding this issue of climate change more generally, and specific results of this COP. So I'm going to take a fairly radical position, and I actually think that it's time to end the COP process. I don't think it's doing us any good. It's actually conducive to self-delusion and false hope. And I was trying to think about the best analogy for this, and I'm going to put one on the table. It may not be the right analogy, but it's like a relationship with COP and the relationships within the COP process are a bit like a really toxic, abusive relationship. So when the public turns up, when the equivalent to the global COPs, and they all come together in a COP meeting, and the public is there and everybody's watching. It's like the cops arriving at the door of the house. everybody's kind of on good behavior and they say, okay, well, we're going to figure this out and we've got a plan, made some promises. And then when the public leaves, when the police walk away from the house, a day or so later, the abuse begins all over again. And we need to keep an eye on what's actually happening in the material world. And that's, I think, for all of us who know this business well, including all of my colleagues here, that's on our mind constantly. But when you look at what we've actually managed to accomplish in almost 40 years of attention to this issue since James Hansen went in front of Congress in 1988 to say that climate change has arrived and it's going to be dangerous and we need to start doing something about it. We've managed to drop the percentage of fossil fuel contribution to primary energy consumption in the world by about, what is it, 3%, 5%. I think we're still at something like 75% of total primary energy consumption is contributed by fossil fuels. When you look at carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, the famous Keeling curve produced on a mountaintop in Hawaii, Mauna Loa, there is absolutely no indication of any diminishing in the slope of that curve. It is an accelerating exponential curve. Maybe not accelerating, but it remains exponential. We've made virtually no progress. And I think on the actual material conditions of climate change. And lots of exciting things seems to be happening in the wind, seem to be happening in the wings, I should say, when it comes to, for instance, the cost of PV solar, wind power, and the like. But when it comes to actually making a difference in emissions and bending that Keeling curve down, we've seen essentially no progress in 40 years. And I think these COP exercises, including language surrounding the fossil fuel phase out, are actually conducive to a kind of mental illness, global mental illness surrounding this phenomenon. That we aren't actually, they keep us from seeing what's really happening. Human beings have an extraordinary optimism bias. It's well documented. I think it's contributed to our survival as a species, for the most part, allowed us to persevere in extraordinarily daunting circumstances through the history of our evolution. But right now, it's a mortal threat. That optimism bias is a mortal threat. And the COP process feeds into that optimism bias. And I can elaborate on these points quite a bit more, but I just want to conclude with, I mentioned Jim Hansen. Some of you may know that he published a paper a few weeks ago with his research team titled Global Warming in the Pipeline. He believes that the IPCC has fundamentally underestimated the climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide forcing. He's arguing that we're seeing an acceleration of global warming. Just this morning, he sent out his latest research post. I'll just read 3 sentences from it. He's comparing the peaks of warming from the previous El Nino in 2015, 2016 to what he expects for this current El Nino. The first 6 months of the current El Nino are 0.39 degrees Celsius warmer than the same months of the 2015 to 2016 El Nino, which implies a global warming rate of 0.49 degrees per decade, half a degree per decade. Consistent with expectation of a large acceleration of global warming, we expect the 12-month mean temperature by May 2024, so less than 6 months from now, to eliminate any doubt about global warming acceleration. The subsequent decline of the 12-month temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius will likely be limited, confirming that the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit has already been passed. So we're going to see that in the next year. He thinks that we'll probably start to bump up against 2 degrees by the end of this decade. So we are not seeing the reality here as a species. We're playing a game in these COP meetings, and it's about time it stopped. Thanks.
Thank you, Tad. Always the optimist. But I love that you make this provocation. Yes, Robin.
I want to respond to this provocation. Can we jump in?
Of course.
Yeah, like one level, Tad, I totally agree with you that it's Greta Thunberg's blah blah blah, and it is a distraction, etc. On the other hand, I think it is a mechanism of the dominant system, the dominant paradigm, and the dominant paradigm is the problem. So it's not, these bilateral agreements, governments coming together. These are organizations, a way of organizing the world, the economic structure that you mentioned. I think it was either you, Leslie, or Julie, I can't remember who, needing to change. These political systems, these global systems are not willingly going to relinquish power or the way they do things. They'll always dance around the edges. So I agree, we could do away with it and it probably wouldn't make a huge difference in what's happening. It doesn't seem to have made a huge difference in what's happening. I think the problem is that we are looking to it to make, so maybe that's kind of the point you're making, is that we're looking to it as though it's going to make some fundamental changes. So I think we need other processes. One of the good things about the global gathering, and yes, we could do it differently and should be doing it differently, I think is what happens on the outside edges of COP. Bringing together people, non-state actors, Indigenous and otherwise, who gather together, can exchange ideas, who are pushing the agenda, making connections, etc. And I think that's the one really good positive thing about COP in the current system, global system, economic, political systems that we operate in. I personally feel like the only thing that's going to change those systems is, unfortunately, the catastrophe we're heading towards, because people individually, collectively, and certainly governments and large state actors and organizations do not willingly say, I think I'll put myself out of business, so that we're looking to them for I think at that level, it's doing what it's meant to do, which is bring countries together and maybe push the signaling to economic markets and businesses and stuff. But that's all within the system that is the problem.
Thank you, Robin. Julie, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I love that you said this, Tad. And I really appreciate your response, Robin, because mine was similar. Because another point that I didn't make at the beginning, though, is that I think I got a little, I find these depressing. I also think there's a big element of waste of time, but I think I found them less depressing when I started expecting a lot less of them. So I suppose the point is how much money, time, energy is being sucked into the COP process and away from other forms of radical mobilization and action to actually change, as you talk about it, Ted, the kind of material, the very frightening material reality of where climate change is going. And I think for me, a lot of work that I'm sure all of you are aware of in policy studies here as well is like the action is not in the process. It's not in the symbolism. Yes, there are outcomes from chat fests and all of this, and sometimes that's really important for making new connections and the exchange of ideas. But nothing gets implemented without someone watching very clearly. And often when it comes to social movement theory, marching in the streets, protesting, all of the social, economic, political pushes that actually turn some vague change in wording or a promise into action. And I do think that's where things, not that there hasn't been a lot of climate activist work for decades and decades alongside these kind of theaters, right? But that at the same time, nothing actually gets done without that. And you do need more people on the social movement, the social action side of things to turn them into anything else. That was not as articulate as I'd hoped it to be, but I don't think we do away with them completely, but I don't think there's anything wrong with really saying that they are a tiny slice of what needs to happen. And they haven't been doing the large job that I think people have allocated to them.
That may be pissing people off enough collectively that they push for different kinds of changes.
Yeah, the thing is, I don't think we're seeing that really quickly either. So if I have a lot more frustration, it is that, right? It's that the cops aren't doing it and the rest of it isn't changing quickly enough either, right? So that's where I'm starting to feel more and more.
Thank you, Julie. Leslie, your mic. There.
Muting. Okay, thank you. I'm glad to hear that too, Tad, because of course I've struggled with this since Copenhagen. After the Copenhagen COP in 2009, believe it or not, that's nearly 15 years ago, everyone said, this is a failed system. We're going nowhere, and we can no longer rely on multilateral agreements to get us where we want to go. And yesterday I looked at the carbon dioxide concentration for 20.6, and I thought, we are absolutely going nowhere. However, I used to say to my colleagues who were saying, you know, we've got to do away with the COP process, the UN's not doing it for us. I used to say, well, at that point, somebody said, if we didn't have it, we'd have to invent it. I'm not so sure about that, but I think the pernicious aspect of the COP is when we expect it to do something that we need to be doing ourselves. And when we expect all that action to happen at that level. And, you know, we need everybody, and everybody has been stepping up, cities, NGOs, the civil society, everyone has been stepping up to a much greater degree than those multilateral meetings indicated. The only thing I would love to see from these meetings is some kind of leadership, some kind of moral leadership, because that's always been the argument about international events and work, is that they exert moral suasion, which would be great if they did. But in this case, they don't. They give us the lowest common denominator, and therefore they do not give us anything to aspire to. Sorry, I was going to disagree with you, Tad, but it looks more like I'm agreeing with you. But all I'm saying is I've struggled with exactly this issue since at least 2009 and probably before. I would love to see them just put in their place, but they're hugely expensive and, as you say, lead to false hope. So even if they're not doing much, they're awfully expensive to do it. So perhaps we would be better off without them. I just can't imagine it, because I do think we need some way of the countries of the world getting together and revealing themselves. And boy, do they reveal themselves at these COPs. So I'll say.
Thank you, Leslie. Robin, you had your hand up?
I could have my hand up multiple times, so you can take it forward as well. Yes, things are stepping, organizations, governments are stepping up. We know it's nowhere close to what happens. And I would say, I think it was you, things like, this is not on most people's radars. I mean, yeah, everyone knows about climate change. Everyone thinks it's a bad thing, presumably, and something needs to be done. But what we're talking about in terms of the investment in COP as doing something that it's not set up to do and won't ever deliver is probably also true of all our governments, certainly our government anyway, you know, here in Canada, which is governments are never going to lead the way. They just aren't. They're conservative institutions serving multiple demographics, blah, blah, blah. I'm not a poli-sci person, but I'm sure somebody who is could speak to that more. So I think the you know, what we're pointing to is, I think, the problem generally, which is we people on the ground, in organizations, in educational institutions, in not-for-profits, whatever, are expecting the government to do something that no government is ever going to do, really, which is get this done. It's not going to be driven. I personally don't think, I mean, you know, these policies emerge from often, like you're talking about the social movements, you know, that result in policy shifts. Governments are conservative. They are not risk takers, and they are not necessarily or even likely to be moral leaders in that regard. They'll respond to their constituents or not, but they're not going to lead the way. I think we have to shift how we think about who's going to lead this movement.
Thank you, Robin. I want to point out a comment that Melina made on the chat.
says, along with time taken away, I saw countless outfits of the day videos on social media with people showing off their last fashion looks for each day at COP that were newly purchased from Amazon, Shein, etc. And will probably we only worn once. That made me sigh. So yes, Leslie, and not only is it costly, but it leaves a lot of waste, and the focus has been taken away from the important matters to sideshows like this that Melina is pointing out. And speaking about stealing the thunder and maybe deviating the conversation, what are your views on the noise that the presence of oil industry and fossil fuel industry lobbyists made during the conference, as well as the choosing of the host country and the very president of the conference? How do you read this information? Anyone wants to go first? Julie, perhaps. Leslie?
Yeah, Gabby, I didn't get a lot of your question. You're muted, your conversation, but I think you were asking about the lobbyists and the fossil fuel lobby and the fossil fuel companies. They've been building up to this for quite a while. You'll recall at Paris, Bill Gates was standing on the stage with the international politicians. So the private sector has been increasingly involved. And I don't know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I tend to be quite scornful of it, but for better or for worse, they are involved. And I think it really came to a head at this COP. And it came to a head not just with the private sector, but the oil and gas sector. And I think it was truly unfortunate, even though, you know, sure, they should be involved, they're actors in the process, but they shouldn't be capturing the process. And I think they came very close to capturing it this COP, if not completely. I don't have a lot more to say about it. I've been quite disgusted by it. I was defending El Jaber at the beginning because I thought a lot of the rhetoric was racist and I hated to see it. But then, you know, this got worse and worse as the COP proceeded. So I think I stopped defending him. But he was there when I was at Arctic Circle. And he was actually quite terrifying. You know, he made comments like, this will be a success or else. And I was thinking, or else I'll kill you, because he was very, very aggressive at Arctic Circle. But, you know, he was aggressive to get something good happening out of the COP. I think feeling his reputation depended upon it. That's all I'll say.
Thank you, Leslie. There's a couple of questions in the chat about, well, if there is no COP, then where do we raise these issues? How do we draw the attention of the public towards what is important? Yes, Tad.
So first of all, I'd like to say this is why I love being at RRU, to have these wonderful colleagues who engage in such an incredibly thoughtful and constructive way with these issues. I don't really disagree with folks' responses to my provocative argument, but it's one I increasingly believe. And so I will extend it a little bit by responding to the question you just raised, Gabby. If not COP, what? Well, there's a body of work within political science that focuses on basically a game theoretic approach to this problem. And currently, as Leslie was suggesting, the game has been substantially captured by private interests. And I think the signal of that extraordinary is that they couldn't actually find a country to host the next COP. Russia kept vetoing proposals. So they finally ended up with Azerbaijan. It's going to be in Baku. Of all places in the world, it's going to be in Baku. For those of the people in the audience who maybe don't know, recognize the significance of this, Azerbaijan is a major oil exporter, and Baku is one of the centers, the original centers of the petroleum industry in the world. So I think another reason to consider shutting down the COP process is that it's now, I think, been suborned by private interests, and especially fossil fuel interests. The Saudi Arabian oil minister said immediately after the language of the fossil fuel phase out was announced that he said it's meaningless to us, it's not going to change our exports. It's loaded with language about transition fuels such as natural gas, CCUS. It's going to have no consequence for the fossil fuel industry. In fact, in many ways, this is in Gramscian terms, the fossil fuel industry has captured this discourse and is making it its own in ways that will allow them to say we're doing something while they do nothing. So what's the alternative? I mean, part of what is happening here, I think, is that the decline of the effectiveness of the COP process is a reflection of the general decline of the effectiveness of multilateralism in global affairs, the decline of what Chrystia Freeland would call the rules-based order. I think that's going to get worse with what I increasingly regard as a likely election of Donald Trump in the United States. I think we're going to see a wholesale collapse of the global climate regime. If there's a chance of pulling something out of this mess, it's going to depend on the big emitters creating essentially a cartel-like approach to the problem. Once it gets really bad and they realize that it's hammering their own economies, and there's a relatively simple game that has to be played at that point involving 6 to 10 actors, maybe even 3 or 4 in the world, making up the largest proportion of global emissions. This would include the United States, European Union, China, and India, and maybe a couple of others, to simply try to shift themselves from the DD cell of the prisoner's dilemma that everybody is locked into the CC cell, for those of you who know a little bit about game theory. But that's not going to happen until we start to see things like significant failures in the global food system that affect nations around the world and start to produce a great deal of civil instability.
Thank you, Todd. Leslie mentioned a little bit earlier the need about changing, modifying the financial system. And it looks like COP obeys to a system that is based on nation states sitting in a forum with state representatives speaking for them. Are we losing sight of the systemic nature of this problem in seeking solutions? And that is one of the reasons why we're stuck with COP instead of finding other avenues to make agreements democratically. Over to you. Leslie, sorry, Robin, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I mean, it's a large question. I mean, I think what Tad said is really important. I echo it, which is, first of all, the erosion of democracy is pretty apparent and the polarization. So I'm not sure we can even look to whatever those institutions are for leadership at this time either. There was a comment or a question in the chat as well around, okay, agree with that, but what can we actually do on a daily basis? And so I don't know that this really answers that question, but we're leaping ahead to where do we find optimism? These discussions of climate change always have that piece because we're all struggling to have any optimism about any of this. And having just completed a Climate Action Leadership Accelerator as part of the McCall, the MA Climate Action Leadership Program, where I get optimism is from people in the room. And I think that, that would be my answer on the day-to-day basis, or the alternatives. We have to start looking to and creating, and not creating organizations, movements, small and large, to address this. I coming from a disaster management background, I feel very strongly that it's what I said earlier and what you just said, Tad, that governments, banking systems are not in the business typically of launching into transformative change. And we know we need radical change in systems, radical change in the economic system, radical change in our energy systems, radical change in our social systems. And those radical changes tend to happen, if they happen at all, after in a small scale in disasters. But I will say that the conservative forces around that typically limit the change that happens and push it back to where it was. So the kinds of impacts that we're seeing now, which are extreme, here in Canada, but certainly in the global South, will need to get, unfortunately, I think, much, much, much bigger collapse of systems. And out of that collapse can come transformation. But I think we, individuals on the ground, organizations, et cetera, have to be anticipating that and trying to think through what we do in those insertion points. Because other people, I can guarantee you, and there's lots of research on this from disasters, other people are doing that. They are looking at those, they're often fermenting those kinds of chaos moments so that they can use them as insertion points to bring forward particular agendas. And I think we need to be thinking about what are the agendas that we need to bring forth in those moments of disruption and catastrophe, unfortunately, that push it in the direction that we want to go, and not wait for them to happen.
Thank you. I was exactly thinking about you, Julie. Over to you.
Yeah, I love that Leslie's hugging her dog at this point. I think, mentally, I think I could be doing the same thing a little bit. I suppose I want to tie a few threads together because these are really, really big challenges. We've gone from the COP that was big enough already to blowing up COP and potentially even the global international order, recognizing the fact that nation states have been hollowed out by capture by corporate interests and other actors for a long time now. Like the literature is quite clear on that. So I just want to back up a little bit because a couple things. One, Gabby, you mentioned that connection to finance, and earlier on Leslie mentioned the fact that some of the text at the COP is starting to recognize more explicitly the connections to food and other systems, right? And I do think that's important. I do think those are some of the inflection intervention points, right? Is where we're not so trained on, for example, COP as the changing thing, the thing that is going to actually trickle down and really change things, right? It is a point for conversation, just like the state as an entity, the nation state is a focal point for lots of different interests. We don't have another thing like it right now. So this is where policies get made. This is the realm of contestation that we have right now. I do think that broadening out our lens to the social movement actors and to the captured role that corporations, particularly fossil fuel interests, have historically played and continue to play is really important. On oil and gas specifically, though, and the trends and the financial side of things, I just saw through my newsfeed today that Canadian oil production is expected to rise in 2024 to a record high. US oil and gas production is expected to rise again. Oil prices are up. And see, one of the things in the COP text was around the need to ramp up really quickly renewable energy capacity. Great, right? At the same time, inflation that's happening in some part due to these increases in energy prices is acting as a drag on new renewables projects and capacity, right? So we have these really integrated kind of systemic issues going on where the inflation caused by energy industries growth expansion doing quite well, particularly on fossil fuels, is actually providing a lot of challenges to renewables. So I'm not answering something here, but I do think that the more we can encourage ourselves and people to think systematically about the interconnections between finance and renewables, between governments of multiple levels. So when the people in the chat were asking about what can we do, there are so many answers to it, right? And it's not just what's going on at the municipal level, though there's a lot. View Royal here in Victoria just banned new gas hookups to homes, right? Just in your own backyard, there are ways to push back against fossil fuel interests, which are one of the significant drivers of the climate crisis. So there's lots of hands up. I'm going to slow down, but I just wanted to say that, the fossil fuel train is still running extraordinarily strong, and that is a great place to be focusing your action. There's lots of other ones at the local, regional, national, and international level as well. But that's where I'd start.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, we have a lot of hands up, so we're going to go in the order as you raised them. So Tad, over to you.
Robin and I are, as always, substantially in agreement about the relationship between kind of systemic breakdown and opportunities for significant change, radical change. My book, The Upside Down, I had a whole chapter with the title Catagenesis as sort of a neologism. Kata, the Greek prefix for down or catastrophe, it's in catastrophe, catacomb, for example, and then genesis, of course, birth, the idea of some kind of renewal or rebirth through breakdown. And I think we're going to see, if things turn out reasonably well, ultimately a century or more down the road, that this century will be marked by a process of catagenesis. And then to echo again, Robin, Naomi Klein's shock doctrine made the point that there are less than benign actors who are actively seeking to exploit or even create catastrophe and breakdown in order to shift things to favor their interests. I think people need to wrap their heads around and get used to the idea that some kind of very radical nonlinearities are coming our way. Material in terms of the climate and the ecosystems that are affected by climate and the food systems and others that we depend upon, but also social and political. This is really what we characterize at the Cascade Institute a polycrisis of intersecting, self-reinforcing crises, problems. That sounds really, really scary. And I think it's terrifying for all of us because there's enormous uncertainty and enormous danger in the future. On the other hand, and as I tell my kids, these systems are way too complex for us to know that it's game over. There are enormous possibilities for novelty, and some of those possibilities are almost certainly positive that we can't fully recognize at this point. So what we do as individuals is we all do what we can. We try to get our carbon output down, we work in our communities, we pay attention to the issues, we look for opportunities and openings when we can find them. There's certain truth to the fact that if billions of people start to move in this direction, it's going to have macro effects that are really significant. Whether they'll happen soon enough or not is an open question. But certainly nothing's going to happen if billions of people don't do anything. So we have to be, as individuals and as families and communities, kind of on the right side of this issue, materially and in a sense, ethically and morally. And look for those opportunities that will arise in times of great turbulence to push things in really positive directions. What we call at the Cascade Institute high leverage intervention points, because those opportunities are going to arise, even if we can't see them right now. And perhaps, we just have to remember the old aphorism, it's always darkest before the storm. It's always darkest before dawn or whatever, I think it is, that there may be shifts and opportunities that are going to arise that we can't conceive of now. But 10 years from now, we'll say that was the moment when we found a new pathway. And I think if I have another moment later, I'll explain why I think this is a truly sui generis and unique moment for the human civilization that raises the possibility of these positive outcomes arising.
Thanks, Tad. Leslie.
Yeah, I think we might be lurching towards that moment, forward and back, forward and back. However, this is not the first time that the international system has failed us or that we've declared the COP process a failure. Remember when the US pulled out, etc. Remember Copenhagen. These have been disastrous times. And what has happened? In the absence of effective international action and in the absence of effective national action, remember the Harper days, what happened? People stepped up. We developed the networks of cities for climate action. We developed all kinds of local and regional cross-boundary initiatives, etc. So, and perhaps I'm just thinking about the end of this webinar, but I actually do think that there is some hope there. And the hope that I get from these COPs is always the civil society interventions and actions. And to tell you the truth, that's one reason I've been so alarmed by having the cops in non-democratic nations, because of the hammer onto civil unrest at them. And so there were limited possibilities for unrest and dissent, the most recent one. But I really think that that is a hopeful sign. And I think that we have faced this issue before, and we just need to dig deep and find those moments. And Robin said it, these intervention points, these leverage points. And I know, Tad, that you think about that too. That's all from me. My little bit of optimism.
You're muted. You're muted, Gabby.
I basically was saying that it's your turn, Robin. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just put it in the chat in response to somebody. You know, I think, again, first of all, I want to acknowledge that we are a panel without any one who is Indigenous. And so, you know, I think where I do see hope, and where I think, you know, for these, I'm a psychologist by training. And so when people enter into counseling, it's almost always in crisis. It's the rare person that comes and says, I just think I want to improve my life and, you know, just even live that much better. And so these moments of crisis are potential, provide the potential for change, right? Because the incentive is there. And most of us don't want to change unless we have to, right? We're creatures of habit. But we can change. It's hard work, etc. So I do see optimism on the ground with individuals and with groups who are doing this work from that lens, from the BIPOC community, from the to us LGBTQ, to you know, communities where there's momentum on the ground to shift the way we do dominant society, because there are other, you know, versions of being in the world that are more congruent and connected to nature, who are not, you know, are more congruent and connected to not like killing the very things that we rely on, you know. So I think we can look to those places, and I put in, you know, just having come out of Climate Week and listened to some, you know, amazing Indigenous speakers, and this idea of, you know, reconciliation, decolonization is climate action. It's many other things too, but these things are inexorably intertwined. And so on the ground in our days, we can do that work as settlers, as non-Indigenous people. We can do that work to try and shift and to look at the kinds of values and paradigms that we are trapped in ourselves and that we continue to perpetuate. And that COP is, as I said earlier, that COP is a part of and is only going to continue to perpetuate, you know, that. So I think we can find those points. And I think, you know, the other piece of preparing for chaos is becoming doing the practice. It doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't happen perfectly, but doing the practice of becoming more able to tolerate uncertainty, more able to tap into creativity, more willing to be challenged and not get defensive and engage with other ideas. All these things that seem very small and people can dismiss and go, well, that's not going to change anything. In point of fact, that is where change happens. It happens inside of us, and then we connect with others who are changing and we move it. And as you pointed out, Leslie, we've seen examples of that in the world, you know, where people on the ground have, you know, pushed for wars to end. It's like, we no longer accept this. And I think, you know, I'm not saying that activism is the only approach. I don't think it is, but I think that sense of like, we all have to see ourselves as leaders in this regard. We all have to take responsibility and accountability for moving the dial forward. Yes, in our own backyards, in our communities, but also in these larger ways that we push governments to do this. We demand that they do that through letters and through voting and whatever mechanisms we have available, which is also varied across the world. And that we listen to those voices who are marginalized. Leslie, you pointed to it, and we said it, you know, like on the edges of COP is where some of the most interesting, transformative, inspired, creative creative conversations happen. Those are not political leaders. Those are people on the ground, NGOs, people from developing countries watching their lands disappear. They're motivated. You know, we have such a protection of privilege, many of us anyway, in the global north, that, you know, I personally don't know that the change is going to come from the global north, you know. It's like we got a lot to hold on to here. And so I think, however, if we want to do something, I think, how do we amplify those voices, work to shift the power differentials, and work on those places that will actually create social change, that will support these other economic, you know, systems change and political change, etc. And be very conscious that there are, you know, not to overstate it, forces working against that agenda. Oil forces, I mean, we talked about the corporate interests and government interests do not necessarily support that agenda of transformative change. So we can't necessarily go to them.
Thank you, Robin. This was amazing. Tad, you had something that you wanted to contribute further. You want to take some time for that?
So, you know, this issue is just so impossibly convoluted and tangled with so many things pointing in various directions, because it's fundamentally we're embedded in a highly complex system, sets of overlapping complex systems. So I'll make one point that could be conducive to pessimism and despair, and one point that I think will point in the other direction. So the point that's less happy is about what the fundamental cause of this situation is. Now, there are a lot of theories out there. People like to point to single causes. It's capitalism, it's settler colonialism, it's the fossil fuel industries, you know, pick your bad guy. And there's a lot of truth to each of those stories and each of those arguments. But I think that really at base, what's happened is that human civilization has become addicted to an extraordinarily powerful and qualitatively and quantitatively attractive source of energy. So just to remind people about what petroleum is like, 2 tablespoons of petroleum contain as much free energy as would be expended by an adult male laborer in a day's labor. Every time we fill up a gas tank, standard car's gas tank with gasoline, we put the equivalent of 2 years of manual labor in that gas tank. We have built an edifice of civilization around a highly complex global civilization on top of a energy source that is extraordinarily high power density and energy density. Basically, power density is the amount of watts per square meter you can generate on the surface of the planet. An oil well will generate thousands of watts per square meter. Your standard wind array will be under 5 watts per square meter. Your standard solar array, maybe 40 watts per square meter across agricultural fields. And then in terms of power density, I've just given you some figures in terms of the amount of energy that's packed in a small unit of volume or mass. And we're hooked. We're hooked as a species. And that's one reason these fossil fuel vested interests have enormous political and economic and structural power in the system. Because we really, as Robin was saying, we really don't want to give this stuff up. It's implicated in every single aspect of our lives. So changing that is going to inevitably be becoming unaddicted to fossil fuels is going to require extraordinary technical innovation in finding energy sources with roughly equivalent power and energy density. And it's going to require wrenching social and economic change, which almost inevitably will be violent in some respects. So that's the less than optimistic point. The positive point is this. This is really a sui generis moment in human civilization in 3 ways. First of all, the human species has never been connected remotely like it is right now. And the ability to spread ideas around the planet and behavioral changes is unlike anything the human species has ever seen before. So I'll just give you a really quick anecdote or example. Between the beginning of March and the middle of March, 2020, maybe by the end of March. Half the world's population locked down. Within about 2 or 3 weeks, the concept of social/physical distancing went global and changed people's behavior all over the planet. There has never been a change in human behavior of such magnitude affecting such a proportion of the human species so fast in the entire history of the species. So that shows that we can see these flips in human behavior very quickly under certain circumstances. Our scientific knowledge is better than it ever has been before in terms of the nature of the problems we're facing. During the 14th century, the Black Death, the affected civilizations didn't know what the cause, the underlying etiology of the plague was. In this case, we know exactly why climate change is happening, and we know kind of what we need to do to stop it. We're not doing it, but we know. But this scientific knowledge allows for change much more rapidly than ever before. To go back to the pandemic, in 2 days after the Chinese downloaded the RNA sequence for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, both Pfizer and Moderna had come up with the morphology, the physical structure of the vaccine molecule by crunching that information through their supercomputers. And then within 20 months, 40% of the world's population was vaccinated with one vaccine or more. Unfairly, imbalanced, not equitable, all granted. But the previous record had been 80 years for that 40% vaccination of the global population. So that's a remarkable acceleration of change. And then the final thing I'd say that I think it creates reason for optimism is that willy-nilly, there's a sense of shared fate emerging on this planet because of the smoke from wildfires, the pandemic, the sense that whether we want to admit it or not, we actually kind of have to work together to solve these problems or we're all going to die together. And I think these three things together, extraordinarily high connectivity, scientific knowledge, and emergence of a sense of shared fate, create a sui generis moment in human civilization. There has never been a time in human civilization where the three things have held simultaneously. In fact, never been a time in human civilization when even one of them is held. So who knows what's going to emerge from that possibility? And that's my ultimate source of hope.
Thank you very much. If anyone from our audience would like to suggest a question, pose a question, please do so in the chat. Robin, you just posted something. Addiction, as we know, is incredibly challenging to address. And what seems to be most successful thus far, if we look at drug addiction, is harm reduction, alternate energy systems, while also introducing, creating new habits and practicing them, reducing our energy consumption use. Because regardless of what we substitute for fossil fuels, our energy consumption will mean that other alternatives, EVs, will also lead to bad outcomes for humans if we don't change practices that surround energy consumption. I would like to ask you, as we're sort of wrapping up the conversation, yes, we've talked about the deficiencies of COP28 and the whole COP series, but if this conversation are still perhaps happening in the next year and the year to follow, what would you like to see and what positive outcomes have you perceived in these conversations that need to be highlighted in order to continue having hope and working towards the future?
I want to consider that question, but I'm just conscious of the question that Daniel asked.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
So he says, should we accept that climate change will occur? Well, and research how to build resilient societies that could adapt and survive this apocalypse. It's not that climate change will occur, climate change is occurring. So yes, you might as well accept that. And will continue to occur until, I mean, our best hope is to slow it down, but it's occurring. So that, I don't know about building resilient societies. I mean, I run a lab called the Resilience by Design, and the term is problematic, like most terms become because it's been co-opted, etc. I'm not sure that resilient societies, the way it's currently seems to be imagined. I guess the question is, what do we mean by that? If we mean that we harden societies and we try and, do all the things that we're doing, I don't think that's super helpful. I think, these fundamental, I personally feel like the fundamental changes that need to happen are to reimagine what a resilient society or a society looks like. And I know that that's a big undertaking, but it's, he also says, as Indigenous people have survived for many of them, apocalypse in the past, and I put a thing in the chat earlier. So like, I think fundamentally, I mean, it's not the only answer, but we have to look at the values and concepts and paradigms that have created this crisis, that continue to, no pun intended, fuel the crisis, and will continue, and also the solutions, because we're not actually looking, I would argue, at the fundamental problems. I mean, yes, energy consumption for sure, Tad, that, or energy systems and our reliance on it, but it's also our reliance on the lifestyles that require so much energy, and the expectation that somehow we are going to be able to carry on. In the Climate Action Accelerator, I said, change without change. We seem intent on trying to change without change, and guess what, folks? I can say, as a psychologist, as a researcher, as a teacher, as a human being, doesn't work that way. Change requires changing, and change is almost always uncomfortable. As you pointed out, Tad, in the case of this global level, it will probably almost certainly include violence. I mean, we already see that happening, the escalation of violence globally. So how do we prepare? I think, I think I already answered that, which is, I personally feel like we have to start doing that work of thinking through what we want, what's not serving us well. We talked about hospicing those things, it's not violently removing them, but hospicing those things that no longer serve us, and coming into a different recognition, a different understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be part of nature, not in relationship to nature as though it's something outside of ourselves. Guess what? We're carbon. And then moving in whatever ways we can, individually and collectively, towards that vision, and helping each other through what is going to be an incredibly, well, already is and will continue to be an incredibly challenging transition. And I don't mean energy transition, that's part of it, but I think a much deeper fundamental transition for what it means to be alive as a human on this planet.
Thank you, Robin. Julie.
Yeah, I mean, your question was about the hope again. And I think that's important. I think what I said at the beginning, I'm going to stick with, in the sense of, I do think that shifting the language towards just and inclusive transitions, which has appeared in there, is important. That's beyond resilience. That's not just surviving. There are particular flags being planted there about who gets the benefits of what's happening. And anyone who studies this stuff knows that we're not getting to justice or inclusivity or anything like that without mass system transformation. So it really does feed quite nicely into what we've been talking about. As an example, so the COP28 text calls for phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now there's issues around inefficient here that do not address energy poverty or just transitions. There's a real conflict there between Canada's existing policies around fossil fuels and subsidies for cap and trade, and also, or subsidies for carbon capture and storage and whatnot, right? So yes, the whole text is riddled with loopholes and all sorts of issues, but that focus on just transitions and energy poverty as one of the places where money can be put is really important, I think. And the other thing I think that is really important, even in our discussions here around, is it useful? Is it not useful? Is this a solution? What are the solutions going to look like? I think accepting and acknowledging the fact that addressing the climate crisis is going to be halting and incremental and incomplete and contested. Like, this is part and parcel of it. And getting to terms with the fact that silver bullet solutions with these layers of complexity and many different issues, that's not possible in my view. And I do think that's somewhat freeing, right? To at least acknowledge the fact that this is not a simple solution. This is not a one venue solution. That this is going to be a really long slog, and it doesn't look like any kind of simplified model. And I think that's really important. And I would also push back against any kind of, it's not even framing things as a crisis. Absolutely, there are crises, multiple crises unfolding, as Tad said, a poly crisis. But sometimes the emergency thinking ends up with an ends justifying means frame, which undermines completely that shift towards, let's say, justice and inclusivity, right? Like, we have to get it done. We'll deal with the consequences to all of these different communities later. And I think that kind of thinking can really undermine the social license and create huge amounts of backlash and revolt and resistance. Now, we already have the revolt and resistance from the incumbent fossil fuel industries and their capture of all sorts of different institutions, but I don't think we need it from the other actors we're trying to build alliances with along the way. So my hope is for people to start to see these complexities, right? To accept some of the complexities, to get used to that feeling of, okay, everything has consequences, right? New renewable technologies have consequences. We're going to need to address the supply chain issues around them as we're rolling them out in specific communities, in specific places, in specific countries, just as we did with our energy systems of the past, and addressing then, of course, like the food distribution knock-on effects and the financial ones and whatnot. So that acceptance of the messiness, which goes completely against that emergency thinking of the sky is falling now and we need to fix it right away, which I understand, but I think there's a lot of different psychological stuff going on. And my last piece on this in terms of hope is that institutions obviously go well beyond us as individuals, and that we can co-create new institutional forms with different norms and practices that either borrow from or lean into the practices in other cultures and societies, or perhaps of the past. So it isn't really just about what you're thinking in your own home. It is about, you know, how you interact at your school board meetings and in your offices, and, you know, how engaged you get at transforming all those different institutional layers within the society that we are co-creating every minute of the day, with varying degrees of power and influence, of course.
Thank you, Julie. Leslie.
Thank you. I thought this was a chance for our audience to talk. I'll just say a couple of things quickly. I'm still haunted by the weeping people from the Pacific Island states, and it's almost irrelevant what I hope for. And addressing Tad's shared fate dynamic. I really think that this is where we need to focus. The victims will continue to be victims, whether it's through international multilateralism or through Tad's vision of a solution. They are going to lose unless we make a huge effort to really try to make our society more equal with more justice. And I know that's pie in the sky, but if you ask me what I want justice. And I hate the thought of those delegates signing their own death warrants, which is what they said. Anyway, I'll close there.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, on the chat, actually, there are not many questions, but what we do have is exactly what you were proposing. People are reaching out to finding sources of hope, things that are happening in the sidelines behind the conversations at COP, outside of the nation-state sphere, and more into the civil society, the indigenous knowledge, communities engaging. But as we wrap the end of our conversation, I will ask the four of you to recommend us, or give us an assignment, a homework, to recommend us something to read after COP has closed and the light has been shot in the conference. Where do we go? Where should we be finding information, reading, listening, maybe watching documentaries, whatever, to rethink the solutions that we need for our climate crisis? So let's start, if you're okay with that, in the inverse order. Or you want to start, Leslie?
Are you asking us? Okay.
Yes, yes,
First of
of
all,
course.
Tad's book, definitely Tad's book. Anything by Naomi Klein. I've got lots and lots, but I'll leave it there. This
you,
changes everything by Naomi Klein.
Thank you, Leslie. Tad, you want to go?
Sure. And so my last comment was very long, so I'll keep this really short. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Julie, Leslie, and Robin for such incredible insight and very helpful to my own mind. I think one thing that's emerged from this conversation that's really important is, and we all, those of us in this business know this, but we need to make it more explicit, is that there are two things going on that are psychologically really threatening: enormous levels of uncertainty and a great deal of fear from emerging danger in the systems, all the systems around us, economic, climate, political, and otherwise. And so the uncertainty and fear, the uncertainty and danger, that's a pretty toxic emotional environment. And I think we all need to spend time reaching out to each other, to our children, to all of the members in our community, to help them come to terms with this in a way that I would characterize as being informed by honest hope. And Leslie mentioned my book, Commanding Hope. I spent a lot of time talking about what honest hope means. And honest hope is a hope that fully recognizes the true nature, the material nature of the challenge we're facing, and then finds opportunities still to push forward in positive directions. But this surfacing of the emotional challenge that we are all confronting at this point, and reaching out to each other to help all members of our community through these challenges, I think is really important. In terms of readings, I think there is one place that's sort of a go-to for conversations about this. It's a website titled Generation Dread that has been, and it's a forum and information source, conversation and publications that initiated and led by a Canadian by the name of Britt Way, who's now based in California. And Britt has produced a remarkable compendium of advice on how to cope with this situation. Because if we're not coping, then we're not going to solve these problems. We haven't got a hope of solving it. If we can't psychologically and emotionally cope as individuals and communities, then the game is going to be lost. So I would recommend going to Generation Dread, Britt Way's materials for the help that we all need.
Thank you, Todd. Julie?
Yeah, I stuck a couple of links in the chat, but there are three for me. One, most recently, is John Valiant's Fireweather. He has a new book out, and it's beautifully written, but essentially it's about the intertwined histories of North America's oil industry, the birth of climate science, and he starts with the Fort McMurray wildfires. I just think it's so timely, and it's really beautifully written, and it is worth a read. Another one for me that was really impactful was by Eric Olin Wright, and it's called Envisioning Real Utopias. And in it, he talks about the development of institutions of countervailing power to actually provoke systemic change. He's from a political economy perspective, but it's very useful, I think. And the last is actually a website and a book called All We Can Save. So it's focused on specific kind of actions that can be taken from a range of different scholarly and practitioner points of view. And then there's a whole community that is merged out of All We Can Save as well. So those are three places I would go.
Thank you, Julie. Robin?
I'm as an academic a failure in terms of remembering book titles. However, these are the things that I would share. Vanessa Andreotti, I mentioned the talk, so you can look up videos and stuff. But this idea of hospicing modernity. I mean, there are other books. Vanessa, so I would check those out. That a notion of hospicing modernity. I think, when it comes to I don't even know if it's more traditional, but it's more of an academic and a readable academic book. What's his name? Simon Sharp, who wrote 5 Times Faster, and it's really looking at the need to change economic systems, the ways, not change science as a whole, but change where science is focusing, etc. So those are 2. And then I think this issue of hope. So, I think of Joanna Macy. I think also of the Deep Adaptation Forum, Jim Ben, and his book on deep adaptation, but the deep adaptation.
Eisenstein.
Sorry?
Eisenstein.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Deep Adaptation Forum is really a community of people facing forward into this crisis and trying to support each other in this very way that we're talking about. So I would look for things like that. And yeah, each other. I mean, I think, yeah, I think looking for community with each other and working to foster and nurture those communities and move those communities into action is as valuable and or more valuable than you know, reading. Is I think we have to come together as people around these things.
Absolutely.
And just last one,
Yes.
because I saw it in the chat and it was like a seminal book for me, which is, you know, as a piece of fiction, it's not very happy, but anyway, Ministry of the Future
Mm.
And everything else he's written.
and everything else that he's written. Yes.
Yeah.
Someone actually asked if you have recommendations for children's books so that kids could start reading and learning about this, but with scientific facts and background so that it's not biased elsewhere. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're basically reaching the end of our time together. And let's just thank Leslie, Julie, Robin, and Chad for their amazing interventions, for giving us hope, for bringing us down in this roller coaster of emotions post COP28. And let us remember, as Diana just put a beautiful picture of the rainbow, and Tad also mentioned, there's always light after the storm. There's always recovery after illness. And let us hope that the future will be a bright one. And also, let's not forget that COP is a reunion of some people, but the solution to the grandest challenges of our world is in everyone's hands, and every one of persons that are hooked here to this session. There's a little acorn that could eventually become a big oak tree of solutions for the world that we need. So thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful weekend. Happy holidays if we don't see each other soon. And thank you again for joining us, and see you next time.
Thanks, Gabby.
Thank you, Gabby.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
your
Gabby.
moderation.
Gabby, that was great.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.